So Macron has decided that he wants to rage quit the human race because that's a totally normal reaction to Western liberalism losing its hegemonic dominance over the entire planet. More specifically, Macron is talking about sending French troops to Ukraine. And no, he didn't say, I'm sending the French army to Ukraine to go fight against Russia. He's not said that. What he said is, we're not ruling that out, and basically that he's open to that, and that he thinks that that would be a good idea, which is not acceptable. I think France should be kicked out of NATO at the very least. If you have a bombastic psychopath who is reckless enough to even think about that, you do not want your military tied at the hip. You don't want your country tied at the hip with that kind of a madman. Because I think it goes without saying that France, a nuclear-armed power, which already is in NATO, which is tied to the nuclear power of the United States, cannot go to war with Russia, another nuclear-armed power. Because when you have two nuclear-armed countries at war, that leads to the apocalypse. That's mutually assured destruction. This is something people used to understand. In the last 15 years or so, Western liberals have decided that mutually assured destruction doesn't matter anymore because it's inconvenient for them. So they just pretend it doesn't exist. They never mention it. They never worry about it. They just essentially want to call Russia's bluff and say, go ahead, nuke us. We don't care. It won't affect us. We have our bunkers in New Zealand. You'll just roast our voters, and we don't need them anyway. Sometimes they act up and vote for Trump or Brexit, and so we're probably better off without the voters at this point. That's the attitude of people like Emmanuel Macron. He doesn't care if he's sending off the young men of France to fight and die, invading Russia once again, or I guess technically it would be defending Ukraine. I guess he hasn't yet said anything about actually invading Russia, but I would suppose, based on the way he speaks, he wouldn't. What's the phrase they like to use? Take that off the table or something. Rule it out. Because we don't rule anything out. Now, thankfully, in a rare moment of sanity, the outgoing NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, has contradicted what Macron said a little bit, kind of in a mealy-mouthed way. He said that there are, quote, no plans to send NATO troops to Ukraine. Well, I guarantee you, for one, that's an absolute lie, because there are always plans. Military is planned for everything. I assure you, the Pentagon has 50 different plans for how to send NATO troops to Ukraine. Now, what Stoltenberg might mean, what he's trying to make us believe, is that NATO is not, they're not actively building up to an intervention, a direct intervention. Obviously, they've already intervened in all ways, but sending actual NATO grunts to reinforce the Ukrainian conscripts who are fighting on the front lines. That's the only thing that NATO hasn't done to support Ukraine. And I appreciate that Stoltenberg did state that NATO's support for Ukraine is totally unprecedented, because it is. There is no situation in the past in which NATO has completely run a war that was on behalf of a non-NATO country and done everything short of sending NATO soldiers to the front line. Because, of course, there are NATO advisors there. Maybe they aren't working directly for NATO on behalf of NATO, but they're from NATO countries. They're from NATO militaries. And they're helping to run that war. After all, Zelensky himself takes his marching orders from the leaders of NATO countries. This is all accepted fact. And so we are, at this stage, one step away from NATO troops on the front lines. And in some cases, in very limited numbers, there have been soldiers from NATO countries fighting on the front lines in Ukraine. But it's kind of a gray area. They weren't there officially. They never are. The Special Forces guys, even the volunteers, RFK Jr., his very son, went to fight in Ukraine in the Ukrainian Foreign Legion, which was humiliated by the Russians, completely decimated by a hypersonic missile. It's actually quite sad that a bunch of idealistic young men from across the NATO realm all flocked to Ukraine only to be served up as fresh meat for the grinder, just like any other Ukrainian conscript. Entire villages have had their younger generation wiped out. The old folks are going to die childless. And so it is obvious that at some point NATO troops will have to be sent to the front line, because there simply are no more young men left in Ukraine. They're even running out of old men, because they're going to burn through the old men faster than the young men, for a multitude of reasons, not just because the older men are less fit, but because there are less older men. Ukraine actually had a pretty good had pretty good demographics from what I recall. I believe they had a decent crop of young people at one point. They weren't quite like what Russia was. Well, actually Russia's rebounded a bit too, but like Russia back in, I think it was the 90s, just had a terrible birth rate. Ukraine, I think, was at the start of the war, at the start of this major war, the escalation in 2022 or 21, I'm forgetting now. No, it's 2022, because we're in 24. At the start of 2022, I think Ukraine had okay demographics. I think they had a decent crop of young people. That's all been wiped out now, of course. Probably a good time to find a Ukrainian mail order bride, although be very careful, because I would expect that they are getting pretty desperate, for better or worse, because the men in their country have been wiped out. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the Zelensky regime starts drafting daughters pretty soon. But before they get to that point, perhaps some NATO country, maybe not France, perhaps Poland, will start officially en masse sending their troops to the front line. And at that point, NATO will absolutely be fair game. Arguably, NATO is already fair game, because they are completely supplying the war. I mean, it's not really fair if you're in a war and the arms are being produced in a so-called neutral country. That's not how that works. We all agree, Belgium was a neutral country in World War I, and that's why, or am I thinking World War II? Maybe it was both World Wars they were supposed to be neutral, but it was considered this terrible thing that the Germans invaded Belgium, or went through Belgium at the very least, to attack France. I think this was World War I. I should know this, but I'm embarrassing myself with my confusions on history now all these years later. They went through Belgium, trampled on Belgium as a neutral country, and attacked France. It would not have been such an outrage, though, had Belgium, which was a major arms exporter via Fabrique Nationale in Liège, if FN were supplying the French war effort, let's say after the Germans attacked France, Belgium at that point could no longer call itself neutral. It would be totally fair game if the Germans then invaded Belgium to shut down FN. Because that's exactly what's going on with NATO and Russia. If they're producing weapons in Radom, Poland, and shipping them into Ukraine, the logical thing to do, if you're Russia, is not just keep fighting the troops that keep to be supplied. Well, you want to take out their chain of their supply chains. You want to starve the enemy military of supplies so that they're forced to surrender. That's much smarter than just fighting them head on. And so you would attack their arms factories. Instead, Russia has been playing somewhat nice, and they wait for these supplies to cross the Ukrainian border before they do anything to attack. That's showing a tremendous amount of restraint. And why are they doing that? Obviously, because Russia does not want NATO involved. They're not going to do anything to escalate the situation. Not because they're necessarily nice guys, but because they're smart and they want to win. And they don't want to do things that are going to destroy their chances of victory. Taking on all of NATO is not an option for Russia, just as taking on Russia should not be an option for anyone in NATO. So, what should we conclude from all this? Well, we're run by crazy people. Our leaders are completely unhinged. They can't accept that the world is changing. They can't accept their own limitations on their power. I mean, Taiwan is another great example. I'm not going to get into Taiwan today. The whole Taiwan situation has never needed to escalate to this point. Yes, the Chinese are not nice guys. I don't agree with the Chinese position on Taiwan, personally. But obviously, China has a say in that conversation. Just as Russia has a say in what happens to Ukraine. That is the reality. You might not like it. You might not like having to work with them. You might not like that they have any say in that, all these countries can't just do exactly as they want. But for damn sure, if this were a country that America had a problem with, none of these people would be throwing a fit. No one waxes about democracy and all that nonsense and sovereignty when it's America telling other countries what to do. Now, America overthrew the Cuban government back in 1917. For what reason? Because Cuba wouldn't declare war on Germany. Obviously, Cuba is not sending soldiers to World War I, but Washington demanded that Cuba align with American foreign policy, and the Cubans said, what do you mean? We have no beef with Germany. Why are we going to declare war on Germany? What does that even mean? We're Cuba. But Cuba at that point had only been around as a country for 20 years. And so the U.S. said, you know what, you're not going to do what we want to say, because obviously the United States created Cuba. They overthrew the government and installed some new president who said, I'm declaring war on Germany. And so that's just the way things are. Small countries have to get along with big countries, with their big neighbors, or else they run into problems. That is a pretty timeless rule. It's never changed. It's always been that way, and it's not going to change anytime soon, no matter how much you want to virtue signal about it. So with that said, I will see you folks back here in the next one.